We go straight on now to panel 3, which is cybersecurity and protection of legacy systems. For this one, we have moderator David Hartell, who's Managing Director of Stellae Energy Limited. David, over to you.
Greetings. Thanks very much. It's been a great conference yesterday and today. So much to hear and learn and everything. And we've got a good panel for you right now to talk about an important aspect. We have these digital transformation technologies and tools, but we have to be aware of cybersecurity risks. May have read a lot about this and everything. We've got some gentlemen here today to share some of their views and thoughts on this subject. We have Keith Frederick, who's the Chief Information Security Officer from RigNet. We have Marcia Calder, the Director of Advanced Solutions from Yokogawa. And we have Michael Lewis, Policy and Framework Advisor from Chevron. So welcome, gentlemen. If you could, I'd like to have you give a little brief introduction of yourself and maybe an introduction comment about cybersecurity from your company's perspective. Keith?
Yes, thank you for that introduction. I go back a little bit. As you can see, the lack of hair on top and the little beard that's growing more hair than my head. So my thought and my experience has taught me that one of the problems with looking at cybersecurity from a legacy system is that I've got to get away from chasing cause and effect and move toward a holistic view. I know that's not a lot of background on me. Let me endeavor. I'm prior military, 40 years ago, retired out of cybersecurity, went into commercial business, supplying cybersecurity to the world, sold that company, started another one, and I'm on my third company of the CISO. Both public and private. I thank you, and I look forward to the conference. Okay,
thanks, Keith. Marcel.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. My name is Marcia Calder. I'm also a cybersecurity consultant, and I have been involved with several cybersecurity projects where I help customers set up the plan. So I'm happy to share my feedback with you because a lot of what I've learned is from customers. I think one of the biggest challenges I see with customers, based on all the feedback I've received from all these projects, is where to start. Normally, we see that security is really a technical topic, but what we see in reality, it is not the technology what is the challenge, but more the how to plan and how to organize yourself. And I think that is also what I'm trying to contribute today.
Yes. That's good. Thanks very much. And Michael, if you could introduce yourself and share with us a sort of a high-level view of your perspective on this topic.
Okay. Again, Michael Lewis from Chevron. I've been at Chevron in my 39th year now, with about 20 of those, or a little over 20, in cybersecurity, focusing mostly on our cybersecurity strategy, trying to look ahead at newer technologies, new security technologies, trying to understand how those may affect us and how we need to secure them. The key to cybersecurity is the key to everything. As we go through digital transformations, we start processing more data to get insights from that. Cybersecurity is a key component, both protect those insights and the data that we're looking at. We need to take a risk-based approach to implement that. Let's try to stay away from the compliance areas. That's probably good enough for now.
Well, that's great. Thanks for the introduction, gentlemen. One of our first topics we had for the panel today to talk about was how do you see advancements in digital transformation requiring changes to IT/OT? We hear a lot about the convergence of IT/OT and how that's sort of opened the door to some of the risks. And I'm curious your perspective on what we ought to be doing about that. Keith?
Yes, thank you. As we look at data transformation in a very broad term, you go from a data and combining IT and OT together and moving toward that. But you need to move toward making that data information. And then you recognize that that's not really good enough, and you want to self-actualize that information to actually be useful and make money, period. The situation is that you need a lot of SMEs, subject matter experts, combined with an AI to actually take that information and move it to knowledge. Now, all of that is fantastic, but it's not just for you to make money, but the bad guys want to make money off of it too. So from a cybersecurity perspective, I'd like you to start thinking, instead of cause and effect, which in an incident, you deal with cause and effect very, very promptly. But as a strategy, move forward with cybersecurity to handle not only today's problem, not only tomorrow's problem, but especially the legacy, because the legacy is actually something that brings you a lot of luggage and a lot of problems. Start moving toward a digital or a cybersecurity strategy, and the fact that, one, get to a point to where you know what you have. Meaning, what is the inventory? What are the types of products that you're dealing with? Your routers, firewalls, switches, desktop, laptops, servers. And you want to make sure that you understand what you have as far as policies and procedures and standards that you're implementing. The next thing you need to recognize in that strategy is, what do you want? The want has to be in the fact that you go from the policies that you wanted, the procedures that you wanted, the standards that you're going to implement, down to the controls. That way you actually have something to assess. Now you assess the want and the have to come up with a delta. And during that exercise, that actually gives you a path forward, in the fact that not only do you have the legacies and the things that are in place, a path forward, and what's missing in your implementation for cybersecurity, and that gives you focus on what money to spend for those. Not just chasing rats down a rat hole, but what is it that you're going to focus on? But as you go forward in your SI equipment, your situation going forward with anything that you're going to newly install or replace, start recognizing that the requirements that came out of your controls have to be part of the requirements for the buy. So as you go to that, I leave you with that. Start realizing, stop doing cause and effect, move towards strategy. What do you have? What do you want? Delta it, and it gives you focus on the money that you do have to spend wisely. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Keith. Yeah, I like your comment on the knowing what you have legacy. Actually, many times operators in the field, when they go searching for issues, sometimes they find things that they didn't know they had. So to capture all your inputs and outputs and data and how things are flowing, you have to know what you have before you can have a right strategy to protect it. Marcel, Yokogawa, really great control systems, well connected. What do you guys do about this convergence of IT, OT, and maybe new risks that are arising?
Now, first of all, I fully agree with the previous speakers. So you need to understand what you have. I think when I have a discussion with customer, the first thing what I do with them is, what is the real problem? And the way I have defined it, is, to be honest, it's not the security itself. It's not the risk. What is the primary problem is the budget. Yeah, you can't mitigate the risk to zero. It's just impossible. So how much money do you need in order to mitigate the risk to an acceptable level? That is, to me, the primary question for security. So that means that we try to help customers to develop a methodology to calculate the budget. And we do this in 3 ways. So we say, okay, first you need to understand your baseline. Where are you today? So everything is risk-based. So what you do by means of risk assessment is to understand where you are. Now, it sounds very obvious, but in reality, a lot of customers have no clue where they are on the, let's say, index of the IEC 62443, because that's what we use as a standard. Yeah, but once we do this and we can explain to them, okay, you are here, and then the next discussion what we have is, where would you like to be? Now, and also there, the 62443 can help you with this. And once you understand where you would like to be, then you can connect the baseline and your target with what we call policies, procedures, and design principles. And once you have done this, you're able to calculate the budget. Now, what happens in reality is that once you calculate the budget, it is very often too much, it's too high. Then you start discussing again with the customer about, okay, what is a realistic plan? What fits in your budget? So, besides that, it is very risk oriented in everything what we do, as well also what all the other speakers are saying, because that is a given. I think the budget, the discussion about budget is equally important, because without money you can't do anything.
Keith, I'm wondering, for a customer, once you worked with them to show them where they are and ask them where they'd like to be, they got to make some risk-based decisions about this. So they may think they have a certain budget, but maybe they need 10 times that. How do you convince them that that's not unreasonable, that yes, you may really need the 10 times that?
So that's where you get back to your strategy, and you make sure that part of that strategy infers or includes the I would, military term would be the head shed, or the guys that are actually in control of the budget. Obviously, the CFO needs to be a great friend. You need to make sure that you refer to your risk, and you refer to the prices of things offset by actually the business unit, and what it would affect the business unit and how. And then recognize that you need to draw that all the way to revenue stream. If you do that, then you're recognizing not just the cybersecurity risk to a system or a user's involvement, but you recognize the risk to the funding of this company, meaning the revenue stream. I know that that's not a secret bullet, a silver bullet. And I know that one of the tools that you have in your repertoire, if you become a CISO, has to be a form of negotiation. And you're constantly negotiating how to make sure that the risk to the revenue stream is minimal. Thank you.
Yeah, before we get to Michael, I think the analogy in the safety world is that sometimes people don't like the cost of safety. They say, well, if you don't like the cost of safety, see if you like the cost of accidents and failure. So trying for people to see that it isn't just the cost of the cybersecurity, but how about the implication? How about if your whole system gets locked up and you can't access any of your systems? That might give you a slightly different perspective. Michael, how does Chevron look at this kind of aspect?
From the budgetary standpoint?
Yeah, I suppose making changes to address the new risks.
Yeah, so from a technical standpoint, I guess in the legacy systems, we tended to separate our information technology and OT systems completely. And as we move into this world of digital transformation, we begin to see, of course, the new devices coming in, the Internet of Things devices that are collecting this data, usually off of the OT systems. Now there's a need to move that data up into the IT systems. That erodes that kind of the semi-hard perimeter that we might have had in the past. and all this new devices, eroding of perimeters, use of new techniques like artificial intelligence, machine learning, that adds to the attack surface. And then, of course, that provides more risks that we need to look at. And so the cybersecurity policy needs to incorporate those new changes, understand where the risks are coming from, and put the appropriate strategies to address. That's why within our digital transformation, security by design, making sure we design security or cybersecurity into the applications, programs, devices that we utilize is a key principle.
Yeah, I like that. You know, it's interesting. We focus a lot on guys sitting in a control room, from the control room up into the cloud, maybe, and everything that can have lots of cybersecurity protections in place. But meanwhile, out on the equipment itself, there could be a local control panel where a commissioning technician has accessed and put in some kind of bypass or block that wasn't aware of back when you get into a more secure IT system. So sometimes people haven't really thought that through. And as you say, getting that thought into the design process, how does a guy in the control room know that there's something that's been bypassed over on the piece of equipment itself? This evolution of the threat landscape, Michael, you mentioned attack surfaces. We talk about people, all the different types of people which might touch our equipment, software systems, the culture, how information flows. How is that evolving the threat landscape, Keith?
Well, the realness of the threat landscape, you recognize that you can move from the IT, the OT being singularities, and you've done really smart stuff like created virtual LANs that actually allow you to segregate in each of those communities. And much like a DMZ, you could create a virtual LAN for each of the pieces that you have in the DMZ. So if one gets affected, that it's not a natural flow to the rest. But you also have to start, that street that I talked about earlier, you have to actually move away from that and go to a point to where you recognize that the router switch, you move to a point where you're putting a secure port on each of that, to where you designate a port per MAC address. And then you have to recognize that you pull back just a little bit further on that strategy, and you recognize that you have to allow some protection so that a MAC flood doesn't happen, turning your switch into a hub. So as I did that, I wanted you to recognize as an example that you need to start looking at all of this holistically. You have really great words out there and strategies, and that some of them are a little bit piecemealed, like defense in depth being more technology, defense in breadth being more that you bring the people and the buildings and the wires in, and you recognize that. But you start to move to a holistic view when you start looking at like cybersecurity framework, or the better of all of those would be risk management framework, where you actually implement a very holistic view. But the threat landscape, you have to recognize as you're marrying the OT, IT together, that you have different parameters now. You have an island that now is connected to the mainland, and you recognize that there's a bridge. So don't forget that the outside guy doesn't have just the IT to communicate with, actually connect to and attack your IT systems from. The boomerang would be that they attack your OT, being that it's more holistic, more of the older generations, and recognize that they can actually use that as a bounce point to attack your IT community. Those are things that you really want to recognize, because all of us think of OT as being island and having its own protocols. But if you're now connecting those to IT, packet technology can easily be used to actually, well, store and forward like we know. You go from the threat of DDoS, the man-in-the-middle attacks, the blacklist websites, the viruses, the brute force, the hybrid where you have somebody using a torrent attack, using an insider giving an address so that the outsider can actually use that as a bounce point. There's a lot of threat, and you have to recognize that by combining the OT with the IT, which is a very smart thing. Recognize all those lessons learned that you had done. You need to start encapsulating them and bring them into the OT community. Thank you.
Yeah, Keith, I always wondered, guys, let's say someone has an FPSO sitting out in the ocean. They've tried to take care of all the stuff they have on their end, and back on land somewhere, there's a guy in a control room. But in between, we may have local communications, we may have satellite communications. It lands somewhere, it goes up into the cloud. That middle zone, I wondered about, how does RigNet work to help make sure that that still stays protected, so the user thinks he's in control on each end, but in between, how do you support them to make sure nobody breaks in there?
We use several aspects. Again, holistically, you want to make sure that your orange is hard on the outside. So we have a SOC. We monitor all our communications in and out of our networks. We actually look inside so that we make sure that we understand what's going on, what's changing. We have SolarWinds, we have Splunk. We have several tools that actually help us understand the going on inside our network as the communication comes from outside, uses our median, and goes to the app. But we also have to recognize that there needs to be a SOC component on the rim on the inside as well, and because you have situations where you have all rigs, you have derricks, you have situations where small islands exist and they don't all use our communication. Some of them actually have their own terrestrial line, they have a satellite line. So when it comes into the POP, we make sure that we monitor it there as well, because they're actually, some of these rigs go directly to each other, and they bounce off of the corporate. So each other rigs, when they're connected that way, can bring problems to every one of the rigs. You have the same problem when you actually direct connect to your corporate, and then you allow the firewall not to actually even scan. And I will tell you that that's kind of scary when you recognize that the firewalls that they're coming off of the rigs aren't even scanning what's coming in and out from the corporate. We really have to, as the mediator for all of these companies, we have to be very strong in a realization that the firewalls, the SOC monitoring with IDS, IPS, AI devices, we have to make sure that what we know is true stays true. It's because one of the things in your strategy is a state table and a state transition, meaning that you have a secure state, you allow certain rules to communicate and change that state, but you make sure that you monitor and validate those changing states. So that's the reason why we not only monitor outside communication, but inside on the rim, in from rigs or any of our customers.
Yeah, good. Marcel, how does Yokogawa, how do you deal with the evolution of the threat landscape?
I think there are two ways. So there, as also a person from Chevron said, you have also this new world for digital transformation. So you're going to have what we call a new technology stack, where you're going to open your OT domain, and that's really different from the past. OT was in the past primarily, it was quite isolated, but now it's becoming more open in order to transfer data to the cloud. And in order to you need to have different perspective on how you do security in OT. What we have learned a lot is, about 8 years ago, we have been invited by Shell and Yokogawa and Cisco to, let's say, convert almost a vision of them to have a 24/7 OT platform monitoring all the OT domains, so the several sites. And so we did this. So we are monitoring around 30 sites from Shell 24/7 for OT security. And during this 6-7 years, we really have learned a lot. And we said, okay, let's start developing a new platform for OT security, because I think one of the biggest challenges you see with companies is there is not really a platform, where you can monitor holistically on compliancy, on technically users, patching, everything. It's just not there. So you get a whole bundle of tools, what you combine, and then together you're trying to find out whether you are safe or not. So I hope that in the future also that there will be more platforms available. And okay, in our case, because we are specialized in OT security, that you have a platform which can monitor holistically, including all the details. So you know whether all the machines are patched, you know who are the users, you see the performance of all the assets. You can interface as a SIEM to the SOC. So you have a 24/7 platform, including incident management. All these aspects in one platform could help users to manage their OT better, OT security in this case. So I think that is the future for many companies.
Yeah, I liked one cybersecurity guy was explaining something to me. He said you might have thousands and thousands of IoT devices, but you also could have rules. And so some devices have a rule. This is what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to send me a 1 or a 0. And as soon as you start doing something different from that, even though I have tens of thousands, that will stand out, as that makes it easier to find something that's been compromised or doing something it's not supposed to be. So I like that concept. Michael, Chevron, a really big company, lots of different kind of facilities. How have you guys managed the evolution of the threat landscape?
So we are proponents of the NIST cybersecurity framework, and with its 5 functions of identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And so just kind of echoing the other speakers, the identify section is where you identify the resources that you have, identify the threats, identify and do the risk assessments. Risk assessments are key because controls are effective only against particular threats. Firewall is a great control. It's really good at keeping outsiders out. It doesn't do a real good job of keeping insiders from doing anything because it's not intended to do that. So you really have to understand what the threats are, who they're coming from, what they're after, and then the controls that you can put in place can help address those specific risks. And by controls, there are protect controls. There's some stuff that we would call hygiene, which are firewalls, patching, those types of standard things that you just need to have in place. Those will keep most of the opportunists out. But they're not, as Marcel said earlier, you're not going to be able to stop every attack. The really sophisticated attackers are going to be able to bypass those hygiene types of defenses. And that's where we have to get into the detect range, which we were talking about also, utilizing the Security Operations Center, trying to do a little bit more artificial intelligence there and automation to try to kind of clean out some of the noise that's coming in, to try to identify the real strong anomalies that are out there and then go address those. And then, of course, even once you detect something, you've got to do something about it. And that's where the respond and recover come in, robust response capabilities, forensics capabilities, which we happen to have in-house, and then recovery activities as well. So you need to have kind of a robust program of defense in depth and all those 5 functions in order to address the threats that are out there, all based on risk assessment.
One of our questions we have from the audience is how cloud-based technology will provide 100% secure data for a company. What about the possibility of hacking data on the cloud? I suppose you guys, Michael, you use different types of clouds. How do you?
Yes.
It's like a big topic, but what advice might you give for this guy?
So 100% security is not possible. Let's get that straight immediately. Cloud, it depends on what type of cloud you're using, but cloud provides some security benefits and some security issues. We did a risk assessment of cloud back before we kind of plunged into public cloud several years ago. And at the time, we were trying to disprove an internal thought that public cloud was inherently less secure than our internal systems because obviously it's out on the internet and therefore its attack surface is larger and there can be attacked. However, most of the cloud vendors, the Googles, the Amazons, the Microsofts of the world, that's their business, and they have put in far more money into security than any oil company could possibly spend. Because if they lose their systems, they lose a whole lot of business from that. And so you can argue that some of the public clouds are actually harder to attack than perhaps some of our companies are. On the other hand, there are risks to cloud. Denial of service is one of those. Where if someone is able to disrupt your network connectivity, now you may not have access to the resources which originally were within your own firewalls and easier to get to. So the risks are different. There are some advantages to cloud. You have the strength of the vendors who can see across the world various different things, see a whole lot more traffic than we do, can anticipate and see risks or take down risks or threats more quickly than perhaps we can. But again, it's a shared responsibility. You can't just offload your security onto them. There are certain things that you still have to do yourself.
Okay. Our next question was maybe some idea of practical cases on how to prioritize cyber investment. Keith, what kind of advice might you have for people about how they might prioritize their investments?
So, investments. Like I was saying earlier, you have to go back to doing an assessment of what you have, what you want, and recognizing your delta. The delta actually gives you focused on what you think, is important. Now, that's not to say that risk doesn't change every day, every morning as you wake up. And you have to readdress your requirements very often. But at the same light, stay the path, stay recognized, focused on what you're trying to do constantly. So in your investments, you have to recognize what's the trade-offs. So you sit there and you go, okay, I've got a website, all it does is marketing, You know, one might say that, hey, it's nothing to my system if somebody takes and captures and changes my website. You'd be wrong. The situation is that now you go back to sit in the requirements, but what's the business unit side of this? If somebody actually attacked and successfully changed your website to something that was not very well, let's say kind, then you recognize how many millions of dollars have you spent on, well, your name. That is actually a very large offset to recognize how large that risk really is, even to the point to where some people on their websites control their temporary memory offline, and their operating system and the web page itself is on a hard drive that maybe you even cut pin 6, which doesn't allow anybody else to write to that. So if a hacker actually got to that website and interfered with the operating system, all he's interfering with is the RAM memory that he is on or she is on, not the actual operating system. So what I would tell and give you advice on when you're looking at investments, go back to that assessment result, recognize that, you know, I've already inferred what was important. I've already recognize how each of the business units I'm working with internal to my company and my customers is important to them, and weigh that out as a realization. You're more apt to recognize what the realization of those priorities are than when you get, you know, a call from somebody saying, hey, I want to know what's your importance, you have until tomorrow night. Constantly, as a CISO, you have to constantly evaluate your risk. Base that risk not only just on the system damage, but also the revenue stream and the importance to a business unit. Thank you.
Yeah, I think one of the questions we had from the audience was quoting a survey saying that some functions like operations, engineering, sales, and commercial maybe deprioritize cybersecurity risk in comparison to supply chain and procurement functions. So probably a lot of internal education needs to go on by the CISO for people really to recognize what is their risk and how they ought to view that. Marcel, do you have some practical advice on how to prioritize cyber investment?
Yeah. So as already mentioned, you have to understand your baseline. So you can do that in two ways. A risk assessment. It partially depends, of course, on the maturity of the customer. So if they're already very mature, then they have a different starting point. But what I see in practice that many customers are at the beginning of the journey. So you start with a risk assessment. You can do this in two ways. You can do it by interviewing, but an alternative is by doing a network scan on threats. There are different tools on the market. So we use, for example, Saris Defense for doing this. And that gives you a very good overview of where you are with respect to your asset. It will scan all your asset. You know what your asset is on the network, and we see also some potential threats. Now, once you have done the risk assessment or the network scan, you will see some priority threats. So that means, or vulnerability, sorry, vulnerability is a better wording. So if we see a vulnerability where we say we have to solve this instantly, then we will give the recommendation to do this. Let's say that those are the number one priority. For the number two priorities, for implementing or solving the number two priority vulnerabilities, we first will talk to customers and say, okay, you have to organize yourself properly by means of having policies and procedures in place. Many companies do not have policies and procedures specifically for the OT. Now, the policies and procedures you have for the IT cannot always use, or in many cases, not even use for the OT. So we have developed a default policies and procedures based on best practice in OT. And what we see if you use those, it takes about 6 months to customize them in accordance with the customer requirement, because every company is different, and the policies and procedures, and in a way it describes how you are organized, has to be in line with how the company operates. And then once you have the policies and procedures in place, together with the organization, together with the feedback from the risk assessment, then you start developing a more sustainable security environment and also solving all the priority 2 vulnerabilities in the plant. But in order to do that, you also need to understand also how much budget you need. Yeah, and again, then I'm going back to the beginning of my story. You need to understand your baseline. You need to understand your target, your security target. That difference, that delta determines your budget. And that is translated into policies and procedures. So if I summarize it, you do a risk assessment. First, you create awareness. You do a risk assessment. You can do a network scan to understand where you are today, solve the priority number 1 priorities in the plan, and then gradually start developing a security management system for OT in this case.
Okay. Michael, do you have some practical advice on how to prioritize cyber investments?
Yeah, so I'll get a little bit more to details. I agree with what the other speakers said, particularly about starting with the risk assessments. Well, I guess the first thing you start with is get the hygiene in place. You know, get the firewalls, get the access controls, whether those are the policies or not, that's fine. But get that minimal type of security in place, because I said that will cut out a lot of the noise. And then the risk assessment. Within Chevron, we base our risk assessments on something called factor analysis of information risk, or FAIR, which decomposes risk into two trees. One is the likelihood side, which looks at the threat and how often one would expect that threat to be realized as a loss event. And the other side is the impact of that particular event. And that brings the business into the function and makes risk assessment in a business element. And from there, you can understand what the business impacts are of a particular cyber event and understand which of those that you need to go after. So if it's an attack on the lunch menu from the cafeteria, the impact of that may be people getting confused as to what the menu is. That's not likely to have a mission critical effect on your business. If it's an attack, though, on an oil rig or on production that could shut down a process control system or cause a health, safety, or environmental damage, that one may get a little bit more priority then, and you can then address the controls to address that particular threat. The FAIR mechanism also allows you the ability to quantify the risk in terms of dollars or pounds or whatever currency you wanted to use. So instead of saying the risk is high and working it that way, you can understand that this risk is $1 million risk or $100 billion risk or whatever it happens to be. And then when you look at specific controls or products or technologies to address it, you can actually get somewhat of a quasi ROI as to the return on investment. And that gives you a practical way of actually looking at different solutions to see which one may give you the biggest bang for the buck. The other thing that type of technology might do for you is to actually show you where you're overspending on controls. We had an example earlier this year where one of our business units complained that they were spending more than an event would actually cost them. And we actually utilized a quantitative risk analysis to show that they were actually right. They were spending about 4 times more than an event would actually cost them. And so we actually took away the requirement to do that particular control. And in an environment where, oil prices are depressed and we're always trying to save money, any place where we can save money in the corporation can be quite helpful.
Yeah, that's a good, interesting perspective there. Having the appropriate level of protection for different places. Another question we have, this I sort of open it up to the panel now. Do you see an increased focus on secure software development? For example, evil user stories, abuse cases, code review, threat modeling, and actually building security into the software, the APIs, instead of bolting on security afterwards. Does anybody have a view on that?
Yeah, I'll take that. So again, security by design is one of our principles within digital transformation. Bolting on security is more costly. It doesn't always work. There are studies that show how effective it is to build a security in, especially if you're taking a DevOps approach to cybersecurity, where you're releasing, or not cybersecurity, software development, where you're releasing modules or functionality as you develop it. You've got to have that security built in because there is no end, like there is in a waterfall model, to actually bolt that security on. Also, software development is getting a lot more complicated now as we start using more open source, more APIs. You've got to be able to have mechanisms to trace back some of the origins of that code to understand where the security issues are, because you may not be writing, or you're likely not writing most of the code that you actually have in your applications. And so we're actually looking at some of the stuff on the supply chain area, the software bill of materials, dependency diagrams, trying to understand what components are actually built into the open source, trying to make sure those are protected as well. So yeah, you've got to build it in at the beginning. You can't bolt it in at the end.
Yeah, I always wondered, as a non-cybersecurity type person, but is it possible to put in the rules hardwired into the design that an API can only ask a question and receive data back? It can't send an instruction. And on the other side, the IoT device can't receive an instruction, but can only send stuff out. How we're able to hardwire that protection in.
Yeah, on OT, you should be able to do that because the devices only should be doing certain things. On the IT side, that's a lot more difficult because the environment is a lot more fluid.
I think,
Okay.
yeah, can I add something?
Sure.
As an example, also, what you see in the OT, you have OPCDA, which doesn't have really security embedded. It's based on ConDecon with Microsoft Security. If you look at the new design, the OPC UA, which has security embedded, so it was designed already by default with security included. So What you see now is when we talk to customers is that, and you're developing an architecture of an infrastructure strategy about the technology stack. So how do you transfer data from site to cloud? What we do not recommend is, for example, to interface an OPC-DA to an edge server. So you need an edge gateway, and preferable, for example, the OPC UA. So the OPC UA will collect all the data from the OTC systems, and then from the OPC UA, it will connect to the edge server, and the edge server will talk to the cloud. Now, so this is a good example where the security has evolved in time with respect to specifications.
Oh, good. Keith, I have a question for you from the audience, from Stuart,
Okay.
actually. A question for, does cyber risk differ by region and country? I guess we live in a connected world, so maybe it doesn't, but I am curious, do you see different types of threats around the world when you provide service to people?
Very, very much so. Being part of RigNet, we're in over 50 countries worldwide with not only equipment, but people. And that's very important to recognize that it's not just equipment, it's people. But if you look at RigNet and looked at where our equipment is, you're probably dealing with hundreds of countries. The situation is that it's a different equation, especially if it's just equipment and not personnel, meaning that our worldwide 24-hour NOC is actually operating all of that, and then the global engineering is actually making sure that it all works. You have the situation where you've got to draw back to that holistic view, and we implement risk management framework as a component worldwide, and then we recognize that we have situations for, like answering the earlier question, for like our system integration and our products that we develop on our AI part of our company for organizations and our customers. We have a standard operating procedure for how we actually implement those, so that we have hardened baked requirements for each of those. Like in our SI, anytime we're building an entire system for our customers, we have a dedicated cybersecurity engineer on that to make sure that we have standardized not only with our requirements, but also our customers' requirements for cybersecurity, and we get a baseline for each of the components. Then we actually have to test those components, and continuously during code reviews or milestones, we actually have to come up with a test. We actually come up with the results. We actually go over that with the customer, and then before we even turn over the equipment for live operations, we retest that and confirm that for the customer. So one of the things that, in quoting a very famous statement, trust but verify, it is extremely important in the cybersecurity world. So thank you.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question. I was always curious about user devices. We're in a more connected world. We've got people working all over the world. As you pointed out, people are showing up with smartphones, tablets, laptops, Bluetooth connected, Wi-Fi connected. How do we make sure that, and these may be trusted insider people and everything, how do we protect ourselves from that being an attack surface? Marcel, do you have any ideas on that?
It's not so easy, this question, because we see a significant increase of mobile devices in the OT. What you see is that companies have to write new policies about how to deal with it. So we have helped the customer with unmanned operation, where they can do operation partially on the tablet if they do maintenance in the field. We had big discussions about what to do with those mobile devices, and they have chosen for that the mobile devices are not allowed to leave the plant under no conditions. So they have a procedure in place where they verify every day whether all the mobile devices are there and how they are used. Beside that, of course, they have security embedded. So we work with certificates so that we know that the devices can only be used, that specific device can only be used. So specifically in the OT, it is really new, and companies have to start developing policies about how to use it. And with also, for example, with the introduction of robotics, so also that's happening gradually. That is also a new dimension. I think not all the questions are answered yet. It's a journey, and by time we will learn about what is the most secure way to handle all those mobile devices in the plant.
Okay. I think that's almost about all the time we have. I want to thank RigNet for sponsoring this panel. It's been good. It's a pretty technical topic that a lot of field users, operations groups may take some of this stuff for granted, but it's good that you keep educating us and help us and give us procedures and policies and layer the defenses. So thank you, Keith, Marcel, and Michael. Thanks very much.
Thank you to you, Dave. Great job. Very well moderated, and a great well done again for putting in the chat box questions. I thought it was a really interesting discussion because, of course, cybersecurity can feel like it's a kind of negative topic. But I really liked one of the comments, which was think about it as a return on investment for each cyber investment. Flip it from, therefore, this kind of sense of do we really have to do it to, you know what, we can prioritize it around the business opportunity. It's kind of a very smart way of thinking about it. Of course, ultimately, security by design is better than bolt-on security. I wish we all had the luxury, of course, of thinking about it right at the start, but where you are at the start of a project, it's kind of a critical no-brainer. Put cybersecurity right at the start of it. It's a good point. It's a little bit like, of course, all good things in life. One of the things that was talked about is you've got this balance between the ideal versus the realistic versus the affordable. And that's life, isn't it? So I think it was good to have a discussion around, so how do you prioritize? And again, I really like this kind of likelihood versus impact fair mechanism to quantify the risk. So excellent discussion.